This is insubordination, Doctor. You countermanded a direct order.
I did what was necessary for the patient, Colonel. We're losing him. Page Dr. Evans now.
Colonel call sign script MD. Say that call sign again. Say it to my face. Colonel Marcus Thomas Reyes did not shout it. He hissed it, low and shaking, the way a man speaks when the floor has just dropped out from under him, and he is still pretending to stand on solid ground. The trauma bay at Ashford County Medical Center went quiet around him. Quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone in it senses that something has shifted, and none of them yet understand what. Fluorescent light hummed overhead. A monitor beeped from somewhere behind a curtain, patient and indifferent. In the middle of it all stood a woman in blood-stained scrubs, dark blonde hair pulled back in a knot, gone loose from an 18-hour shift, a thin white scar tracing the underside of her left forearm that no one in that hospital had ever asked her about. On her badge, in small block letters beneath her photograph, it read, S. Doyle, RN, Trauma. Down the hallway, just past the double doors, a resident named Priya Anand had stopped mid-step with a stack of charts against her chest, close enough to hear the colonel's voice crack on the second half of that sentence, far enough that neither man nor woman in that room knew she was listening. She would remember, later, that she had felt something go cold in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the sense of standing at the edge of something much larger than a hospital hallway. A trauma nurse who moved like she'd done this before, under fire, with worse odds. A woman the entire east wing of Ashford County was about to stop underestimating. If you've never heard a story like this before, stay a while. It's the kind of story that rewards patience. And if this is your first time here, consider sticking around and subscribing. This channel tells true stories about the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people the world assumes it already understands until the moment it's proven wrong. Now, let's get into it. 3 hours before Colonel Reyes ever set foot inside Ashford County Medical Center, the trauma floor did not slow down for sunrise. It never did. Sarah Kathleen Doyle had been on shift for 31 hours by the time the sun came up over the parking structure, and she did not look like a woman who had noticed. Her scrubs carried 3 different generations of bloodstains, the newest still faintly damp at the cuff. Her left knee ached in the particular way it had ached every winter for the last 6 years. An old injury she had never bothered explaining to anyone who asked, because no one asked twice. She moved through the department with the unhurried economy of someone who had long ago stopped wasting motion. No rushing, no wasted steps, hands finding what they needed before her eyes had fully confirmed it was there. The younger nurses on the floor had a theory about Sarah Doyle, one they never said aloud, but carried anyway. The way people carry assumptions about someone they've decided not to ask real questions of. They thought she was cold, detached, a woman who had been doing this job so long that the human part of it had worn away and left only the mechanics behind. She rarely joined the break room conversations about weekend plans or difficult attendings, or the new coffee machine that never worked. She answered questions in short, complete sentences, and then returned to whatever her hands were already doing. It was easy, from a distance, to mistake her stillness for indifference. It was only in the moments that mattered, the ones where a patient's blood pressure began sliding sideways on the monitor before the alarm caught up to it, the ones where a resident's hands began to shake over a chest tube, that anyone noticed the truth was the opposite. Sarah Doyle was not cold. She was economical with everything that didn't serve the patient in front of her, including her own emotional performance, because she had learned, a long time before Ashford County, that panic was a currency, and she preferred to spend as little of it as possible. That morning, she had already worked 2 codes, restarted an IV a first-year resident had blown twice, and quietly repositioned a patient's airway before the attending had finished reading the chart. No one thanked her for any of it. She had not expected them to. She checked her watch, 6:47 in the morning, and started her next round. the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead the way they always did, indifferent to how long she had been standing beneath them. What no one at Ashford County Medical Center knew, not her supervisor, not the hospital administrator, not the residents who mistook her silence for coldness, was that Sarah Doyle had spent 6 years of her life as a Special Forces combat medic, attached to a military free-fall detachment that operated in places most of her current co-workers couldn't find on a map. Her call sign, given to her not by choice but by the men who served beside her, was Wraith, earned not for cruelty or violence, but for something quieter and more exacting, the ability to move through a collapsing situation, under fire, without ever once losing the thread of who needed her hands next. 4 years ago, in the mountains outside the Peck River Valley, in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, she had kept 3 wounded soldiers alive for 11 hours, in a position that should have gotten all 4 of them killed, working by feel in the dark, because a headlamp would have marked their position, stopping arterial bleeding with pressure and improvisation and a stillness under fire that the men she served with never forgot. That was the mission that earned her the name. She had never once repeated the story herself. She didn't talk about it, not because it was too painful to speak of, though parts of it were, but because she had learned, early and permanently, that once people knew, they stopped seeing her and started seeing the story instead. She didn't want to be handled carefully. She didn't want to be asked to perform gratitude for having survived something, or heroism for having done her job. She wanted to change a dressing without someone watching her hands for a tremor that wasn't there. She wanted to be Sarah Doyle, trauma nurse, and nothing more complicated than that, because complication was exhausting in a way that combat had never been. Dr. Richard Allen Pemberton had run the trauma department at Ashford County Medical Center for 19 years, and in nearly 2 decades, he had built the floor into something he privately considered his own creation, a system of protocols, hierarchies, and unspoken rules that, in his mind, existed for one reason only: to keep patients alive by keeping chaos in check. He was not a cruel man. He believed, with total sincerity, that the chain of command he enforced with such rigidity was the only thing standing between an orderly trauma bay and a room full of well-meaning people getting somebody killed. 19 years of watching residents freeze, watching families panic, watching well-intentioned staff make catastrophic mistakes, had convinced him that structure was not bureaucracy. Structure was survival. Somewhere in those 19 years, though, that belief had calcified into something less noble than he told himself it was. Somewhere along the way, protecting the system had become difficult to distinguish, even to himself, from protecting his own authority inside it. He had a habit, small, almost unconscious, of speaking over nurses mid-sentence, when they offered an observation he hadn't asked for, not because the observation was wrong, but because he had not yet decided it was worth hearing. He did it to Sarah Doyle more than most, though he would not have been able to say why if pressed. Something about her stillness unsettled him in a way he had never examined closely. The morning it happened, a patient arrived by ambulance, a construction worker named Daniel Ruiz, 42 years old, a steel beam injury to the abdomen, blood pressure dropping in a way the monitors had not yet flagged as critical. Sarah placed her hand against his side before the attending had finished reading the intake sheet, felt the subtle rigidity building beneath the skin, and repositioned the IV line without asking permission from anyone. She caught the internal bleed nearly 4 minutes before anyone else in the room would have. She said nothing about it. She stepped back into the periphery before Dr. Pemberton had even turned to look, letting the surgical team take over the moment she'd created for them. Priya Anand, the second-year resident closest to the bed, saw it happen. She saw the calm, deliberate certainty in Sarah's hands, the way she moved without asking, without needing to be told, without waiting for credit. Priya said nothing in the moment, but she filed it away, The way you file away the first piece of evidence that someone you've underestimated is not who you assumed. It was less than an hour later that Dr. Pemberton found Sarah at the nurse's station, reviewing Daniel Ruiz's post-op orders with the kind of quiet focus that made her easy to overlook and impossible to rush. "You adjusted his line without authorization," Pemberton said, his voice pitched to Carrie, though he told himself afterward that he hadn't meant it to. Several nurses nearby went still, the particular stillness of people who sense a public correction about to happen and don't want to be caught watching it. "I caught a bleed the monitor hadn't flagged yet," Sarah said, her voice level, the tone of someone delivering a diagnosis to a family that doesn't want to hear it. 4 minutes, maybe 5, before it would have shown up on the numbers. I documented it. "That's not your call to make," Pemberton said. "You're a nurse, not a trauma attending. There's a reason for the chain of command, Ms. Doyle, and it isn't decorative." "I understand the chain of command," she said. "I also understand what internal bleeding looks like before it becomes a number on a screen." Something in his jaw tightened. That kind of freelancing gets people killed. It gets people killed by nurses who think their instincts outrank protocol. He let the word freelancing sit there, deliberate, precise, chosen because he knew exactly how it would land. "I won't have cowboys on my floor." She did not raise her voice. "I'd rather be a cowboy who's right than a bystander who's careful," she said, and something in the quiet certainty of it made 2 nurses near the station look up from what they were doing. Pemberton's face reddened. "You're 1 incident report away from a suspension. I'd suggest you remember whose floor this is." The threat hung there, concrete and public, the kind of thing that couldn't be walked back once said aloud in front of witnesses. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't argue further, didn't defend herself with more words than the situation required. She simply said, "Understood," and went back to reviewing the chart in her hands, her voice as even as it had been at the start of the exchange, as if the threat had landed somewhere that didn't quite reach her. It wasn't defiance, not the kind anyone in that hallway would have recognized as defiance. It was something quieter. She became very still, the particular stillness of someone who has weathered far worse threats than the loss of a job, and that stillness seemed, for a moment, to fill more of the hallway than Pemberton's raised voice had. He opened his mouth to say something else, and found, unexpectedly, that he didn't have anything ready. Something in her posture had bypassed whatever assumption he'd walked in with, and landed somewhere else entirely. Somewhere in him that recognized, without being able to name it yet, that he was standing in front of a kind of authority he did not have the rank to challenge. It was into that exact silence, 4 minutes later, that Colonel Marcus Thomas Reyes walked through the ambulance bay doors, flanked by 2 military escorts, directing the emergency transport of a wounded Army Ranger, Staff Sergeant Elias Whitfield, 26 years old, injured in a training accident at Fort Bragg, and flown in for specialized trauma care after complications at the base hospital. Reyes was mid-sentence, barking coordinates and vitals to the incoming trauma team, when his eyes crossed the room and landed, almost by accident, on Sarah Doyle's exposed forearm, on the thin white scar that traced its underside, and just above it, the edge of a small tattoo she had never bothered concealing because she had never expected anyone at Ashford County to recognize it. A stylized owl in flight, wings spread, talons empty, the insignia of a detachment that did not officially exist on any public roster. Colonel Reyes stopped breathing, not figuratively. The room would later describe it as an actual pause, a full 3 seconds in which he did not move, did not blink, did not finish the sentence he'd been midway through. His escorts nearly walked into him. "Say that call sign again," he said, low, disbelieving. "Say it to my face." He was not speaking to Sarah. He was speaking to the tattoo, to the memory it had detonated in him, to a version of the past he had never expected to walk back into a civilian trauma bay in North Carolina. Sarah met his eyes, calm, unreadable, and said nothing at all, because she hadn't said the call sign. He had recognized it on his own. "Wraith," he said again, quieter this time, almost reverent. You're Wraith. Every head in the trauma bay turned. Dr. Pemberton, still standing 3 feet away, with the threat of suspension barely cold on his lips, turned as well, and watched a full-bird colonel come to something close to attention in the middle of his trauma floor. Reyes crossed the room in 4 strides, and did something none of the nurses present had ever seen a man in uniform do inside a civilian hospital. He saluted her, sharp and formal, in front of God and the entire East Wing. Kunar Province, he said. 11 hours, 3 men. I read the after-action report 100 times. I never thought I'd... He stopped himself, shook his head once, and looked at her properly, the way you look at someone you'd filed under legend and never expected to meet in scrubs. I commanded the QRF that pulled you and your patients out. I never got your name. Command kept it need to know. Dr. Pemberton stood very still, his authority evaporating in real time, without a single word being spoken against him. No one humiliated him. No one needed to. He simply understood, watching a colonel salute the nurse he'd threatened with suspension 20 minutes earlier, that he had misjudged something fundamental, and that the misjudgment had been entirely his own to carry. There was no time to process it. Staff Sergeant Whitfield's vitals were dropping on the gurney behind them, and the trauma bay reorganized itself around a new and undeniable fact. The woman they'd underestimated for 2 years was, in this exact moment, the most qualified person in the building. Sarah moved before anyone told her to. She crossed to the gurney, cut through the chaos of 6 people talking over each other, and took command of a room that no longer questioned whether she had the right to. I need a type and cross, and I need eyes on his abdomen, not just his leg, she said, her voice carrying the specific calm of someone who had run triage under conditions infinitely worse than this one. A resident hesitated over the wound dressing, uncertain, and Sarah's hand was there before the hesitation cost anything, repositioning the pressure, redirecting the resident's fingers with 2 words of instruction instead of a correction. There! Hold that! Priya Anand, still holding her stack of charts from the hallway, stepped forward without being asked, falling into position at Sarah's side, the way a person falls into step with someone they've already decided to trust. Tell me what you need, Priya said, and Sarah gave her 3 things in rapid succession: blood products, a second line, a call to the OR, each one delivered with the precision of a woman who had spent years learning exactly how many words a crisis could afford to waste. The first decision came fast. Whitfield's blood pressure was falling out of proportion to his visible wounds, which told Sarah there was an internal source no one had located yet. She pressed her palm flat against his lower abdomen, felt the same subtle rigidity she'd caught in Daniel Ruiz hours earlier, and called it, before the ultrasound confirmed it. Free fluid, left upper quadrant. He's bleeding somewhere the leg wound isn't explaining. The trauma surgeon, arriving mid-sprint, didn't question it. He simply moved the imaging where she pointed, and the scan confirmed what her hands had already told her. A lacerated spleen, small enough to have hidden itself from a cursory exam, large enough to kill him by early afternoon if it went unaddressed. Time measured itself in heartbeats now, and Sarah had already spent the ones that mattered. The second decision came from her hands, not her voice. She noticed the IV line the flight medic had placed was infiltrating, the fluid pooling under the skin instead of reaching the vein, a slow, silent failure that wouldn't have announced itself until the resuscitation stalled, and no one could explain why. She swapped it herself in under 30 seconds, without narrating what she was doing, because narrating it would have cost time the patient didn't have. She chose the antecubital vein on the first pass, the kind of choice that looked like luck to anyone who hadn't spent years learning that it wasn't. The third decision required her to override a call already in motion, and she did it without raising her voice above the pitch a crisis could tolerate. A second-year resident had begun prepping for a rapid intubation, reasonable on paper, dangerous in practice. Whitfield's blood pressure was too unstable to survive the sedation the protocol called for. "Hold the tube," Sarah said, stepping into the resident's line of sight rather than simply speaking past him, a small courtesy that let him hear her, as a colleague, rather than an interruption. "Push fluids first. If we sedate him at this pressure, we lose him on the table before we ever get the blade in." The resident hesitated for exactly 1 second, glanced toward Dr. Pemberton for confirmation, and found the surgeon already nodding. He held the tube. Whitfield's pressure climbed 9 points in the next 90 seconds, enough to make the intubation survivable when it finally happened. Afterward, the resident would tell Priya that the strange part wasn't being overruled. Residents got overruled constantly, by attendings, by protocols, by senior nurses who'd seen more than they had. The strange part was that Sarah's correction hadn't felt like a correction at all. It had felt like being handed information he needed, and hadn't had a moment earlier, delivered without a trace of the condescension he'd braced for. He would remember that distinction longer than he remembered the save itself. Colonel Reyes, still standing near the doorway with his escorts, watched this particular exchange with the specific attentiveness of a man measuring a stranger against a reputation he'd carried for 4 years. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, to find something diminished, the difference between the medic in the after-action report and whatever civilian version of her might have settled into a hospital job. What he saw instead was the same economy of motion, the same refusal to waste a word or a gesture on anything that didn't serve the patient in front of her. It occurred to him, watching her redirect the resident without breaking stride toward the next problem, that the mountain hadn't made her who she was. It had only revealed something that had already been there. The fourth decision was quieter than the others, and it belonged to her ears rather than her hands. Somewhere beneath the noise of the room, the monitors, the voices, the wheeled cart banging through the doorway, Sarah caught a change in the rhythm of Whitfield's breathing, a faint asymmetry that meant one lung was no longer moving air the way the other was. She listened with her stethoscope for 4 seconds, no longer, and called it plainly. "Diminished breath sounds on the right. He's got a pneumothorax starting. Not from the leg wound, from the fall before the transport. Get me a chest tube kit before it becomes a tension." No one argued. The surgical resident who placed the tube 10 minutes later would tell Priya afterward that Sarah had caught it a full 10 minutes before it would have shown up as a drop in oxygen saturation. 10 minutes that on a chest this unstable would have mattered enormously. The fifth decision was the one that required her to manage a person rather than a wound. Blood arrived from the bank in 4 units, cold and heavy in their bags, and the transfusion had to move fast enough to keep pace with what Whitfield was losing, without moving so fast that it overwhelmed a heart already working past its limits. Sarah calculated the rate in her head without reaching for a chart, adjusted the pump herself, and then checked it twice more in the following 10 minutes, not because she doubted her own math, but because she had learned, a long time ago, in a much darker room than this one, that the second check was the one that caught the mistake the first one missed. She warmed the second unit in her palms for a few seconds longer than protocol strictly required, an old habit from mountainsides where the equipment to do it properly hadn't existed, and adjusted the drip rate downward by a fraction when Whitfield's heart rhythm showed the faintest suggestion of strain, a change so small that the monitor itself hadn't yet flagged it as significant. The surgical attending covering the OR that morning, a soft-spoken trauma surgeon named Dr. Elaine Marsh, who had crossed paths with Sarah only in passing over the past 2 years, watched the last 3 decisions unfold from the doorway before scrubbing in, and something in her posture shifted as she watched. Not suspicion exactly, but the particular recalculation of a colleague quietly revising an old assumption. She had always found Sarah pleasant enough, competent enough, unremarkable enough not to think about twice. By the time she pulled her mask up over her face, she had stopped thinking of her that way entirely. "Whoever trained you," Marsh said, pausing at the doors. "I'd like to know who it was." Sarah didn't answer directly. She only said, "Good instructors," and returned to the monitor. But Marsh carried the exchange with her into the operating room, and it changed, in some small, permanent way, how closely she listened the next time a trauma nurse offered an observation she hadn't asked for. It was in the middle of the fourth decision that Priya Anand's hands began to shake. She was 3 minutes into prepping a second unit of blood when her breathing went shallow and fast, in the particular way that precedes a resident freezing entirely. Her eyes fixed on the bag in her hands, as though it might slip through her fingers if she looked away from it even once. Sarah caught it before it became a problem. She didn't stop what she was doing to address it directly. There wasn't time for that. But she put one hand briefly on Priya's shoulder, the only unnecessary touch she allowed herself in the entire encounter, and said 4 words, quiet enough that only Priya heard them over the noise of the room. "You know how to do this. Nothing more." Priya's hands steadied within seconds. She finished the line, and later she would say it was the calmest 4 words anyone had ever said to her in the middle of a crisis, precisely because they hadn't sounded like reassurance. They had sounded like fact. Dr. Pemberton, for his part, did not try to reassert command. He did something smaller, and in its smallness, more honest than anything he'd said all morning. He picked up a phone and personally called the blood bank to expedite the cross-match himself, standing off to the side of the bay, doing the unglamorous, necessary work that no one would remember him for. He did not announce that he was doing it. He simply did it, and when the second call came through, faster than protocol usually allowed, he set the phone down and moved to the supply cart without being asked, restocking gauze and pressure dressings with the quiet, useful anonymity of a man who, for the first time in 19 years, understood that the room did not need him to run it. It needed him to be useful. For the next 40 minutes, Sarah Doyle did not stop moving, and she did not once look toward Colonel Reyes for approval or acknowledgement. She didn't need it. Whitfield's bleed was found, controlled, and repaired in surgery, a source of injury that would have gone undetected for critical additional minutes, without her hands finding it first. A collapsing lung caught before it became a tension pneumothorax. A transfusion managed with a precision that kept a failing heart from being asked to do more than it could bear. When the surgical team finally wheeled him out toward the OR, stable, the room exhaled all at once, the particular collective breath of people who had just watched a life get saved in real time and were only now allowing themselves to feel it. Sarah did not celebrate. She checked the clock, 8:12 in the morning, updated the chart, and went to find a clean set of scrubs, because the blood soaking through the current ones had stopped being useful information the moment Whitfield left the bay. She found Colonel Reyes waiting for her outside the instrument room 40 minutes later, alone, his escort dismissed, his posture different than it had been in the trauma bay, softer, less official, a man rather than a rank. He held something small in his closed hand. "I looked up your file while he was in surgery," Reyes said. "Took some doing, most of it still classified, but I pulled what I could." He opened his palm. A challenge coin sat in it, worn at the edges, the owl insignia stamped into its center, identical to the tattoo on her arm. "This belonged to the detachment commander who wrote your after-action report. He wanted you to have it, if we ever found you. He passed 2 years ago, never got the chance." Sarah looked at the coin for a long moment before she took it, turning it once between her fingers, the way you handle something you'd stopped expecting to see again. "Kunar was a long time ago," she said. "Doesn't look like it slowed you down any." Reyes studied her, the way you study someone you're trying to reconcile with an old, half-mythical story. "You could still requalify. There's a training command position that would take you in a heartbeat. People like you don't come along twice in a career." "I'm not her anymore," Sarah said, not unkindly, not defensively, simply stating a fact she had made peace with a long time before he'd ever walked through those doors. The medic who kept 3 men alive on a mountainside is someone I used to be. The nurse who just kept your sergeant alive is who I am now. They're not the same person, even if they share the same hands." Reyes was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "I'm not sure I believe that's as separate as you're making it sound," he said. "But I've learned not to argue with someone who's already made peace with a decision." He didn't press her further. He nodded once, the way soldiers nod when they've decided to let a matter rest, and left the coin in her hand. Dr. Richard Pemberton did not seek Sarah out that day. It took him 3 days, in fact. 3 days of reviewing the incident report on Daniel Ruiz. 3 days of replaying the moment in the hallway where he'd called her a cowboy in front of half the floor. 3 days of looking at his own hands on the desk in his office and not quite recognizing what he saw there. When he finally found her, it was in the break room, and there was no audience, no performance, nothing that could be mistaken for a public correction of the public dismissal he'd delivered days earlier. "I was wrong," he said. "No qualifications, no explanation about protocol or chain of command, nothing to soften the sentence into something more comfortable for himself. About the line, about calling you a cowboy, about assuming instinct and recklessness were the same thing." He paused. 19 years, and I've never once had a colonel salute someone on my floor. I keep thinking about how close I came to writing you up for saving that man's life, 4 minutes early." Sarah didn't tell him it was fine, because it hadn't been. She didn't perform forgiveness she hadn't fully arrived at yet. "You built a good floor," she said instead, which was true, and which was also, in its way, an acceptance of something he hadn't quite managed to ask for outright. "Just remember, protocol is supposed to serve the patient, not the other way around." He nodded, and that was the whole of it. No embrace, no dramatic reconciliation, just two people who worked in the same building, choosing to move forward, with a little more honesty between them than they'd started with. By the following week, the story of the colonel and the trauma nurse had made its way through every corner of Ashford County Medical Center, the way stories do in hospitals, past hallway to hallway, until the details blurred at the edges. Sarah didn't correct any of it. She picked up her clipboard the way she always had, checked the bay assignments for her shift, and walked back onto the floor at 6:47 in the morning, same as any other day. The department moved around her the way it always had, nurses calling for supplies, monitors beeping from 3 directions, a resident asking a question 2 beds down, indifferent to what had happened days earlier, full of people who had no real understanding of who had just walked past them. She had never needed them to know. She needed only to be somewhere she was useful, and she already knew exactly where that was. There's something in Sarah Doyle's story that stays with you long after it ends, and it isn't the salute, or the coin, or even the 11 hours on a mountainside in Kunar province that no monitor could ever fully record. It's the 2 years she spent on that trauma floor, being quietly mistaken for cold, for unremarkable, for someone whose stillness meant she had nothing left to give. We do this more often than we'd like to admit. We decide what a person is worth based on what they're holding when we meet them. A clipboard instead of a rifle, a badge instead of a citation. We build our categories fast out of uniforms and titles and the small, visible fragments of a life. And we rarely account for what those categories can't see. The mountain someone survived before they ever walked into our hallway. The 11 hours they kept 3 strangers alive in the dark. The reasons they might choose never to mention any of it. Sarah didn't need Colonel Reyes's salute to know what she was capable of. She'd known it long before he walked through those doors, in the quiet, unwitnessed moments where she caught a bleed no one else saw, and stepped back before anyone could thank her. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't need an audience. The kind that does the right thing at 6:47 in the morning, 31 hours into a shift, with no one watching and no one keeping score. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that quiet competence is still competence, even when nobody's applauding it. And if you haven't already, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next. These stories exist because you keep showing up for them. Thank you.